Welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we bring you the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's most heated discussions from Hacker News. Out of 29 stories that crossed our radar, we've picked the 5 that really captured the community's attention. And boy, did they spark some debates. We've got everything from AI anxiety to open source triumphs today. Developers are questioning whether AI is actually making them more productive or just making them think they're more productive. We're seeing new integrations that people desperately wanted but might have been rushed to market. And in a feel-good twist, we'll talk about a beloved open source project that came back from the dead after 5 years. But first, let's start with a story that perfectly captures the current tension in our industry. The promise versus the reality of AI in software development. Story 5. Where's the shovelware? Why AI coding claims don't add up. All right, so here's a story that's really stirring up the developer community right now. Where's the shovelware? Why AI coding claims don't add up. This one hit 422 points on Hacker News with over 260 comments. And honestly, it's asking the question that I think a lot of developers have been quietly wondering about. So we've got this veteran developer, 25 years in the trenches, who basically went from being an AI coding evangelist to, well, calling BS on the whole thing. And the way he figured this out is actually pretty clever. He read about this Metra study, that's METRA, where they found that developers thought AI was making them 20% faster, but when they actually measured it, they were 19% slower. That's not just wrong, that's wrong by almost 40 percentage points. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Our author decides to run his own experiment. And get this, he uses coin flips. Literally flipping a coin to decide whether he codes with AI or without it for each task. No bias, no cherry picking, just pure random assignment. And what does he find? The AI consistently made him slower, not just on complex stuff either. We're talking across different types of tasks. But here's the real kicker, and this is what the title's getting at. If AI really makes developers 10 to 50 times more productive, like some people are claiming, where's all the new software? Think about it. If I could suddenly code 50 times faster, I'd be shipping a new app every weekend. The app stores should absolutely be drowning in new applications. Solo developers should be building things that used to take entire teams. We should be seeing what he calls shovelware, quick and dirty apps, everywhere. But we're not.
The Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because you're seeing this split between developers who are like, finally, someone said it, and others who are more nuanced about where AI actually helps. One of the top comments talks about how their company went full AI first mode and slashed project timelines by 80% based on basically nothing, just pure hype. Can you imagine being told your 3-month project now needs to be done in 3 weeks because AI will help? Now, to be fair, there are some dissenting voices. There's this commenter, Searles, who claims that AI agents, and they're specific about this, became genuinely useful around April or May of 2024. They say they're now building what would have taken weeks in just days. So maybe we're right at the beginning of seeing this explosion of software. But even they admit they're building shovelware, not complex systems. What I find really compelling about this whole discussion is that developers are getting specific about where AI actually helps versus where it's just noise. Scaffolding code? Sure. Learning a new API? Absolutely. Writing test mocks? Great. But when it comes to the real meat of programming, understanding complex requirements, designing systems, solving novel problems, that's where the AI hits a wall. There's also this interesting side effect that came up in the comments. Some folks are saying that even if AI doesn't make you faster, forcing yourself to write clear enough documentation and tests for the AI to understand your code is making their code bases better. It's like the AI is accidentally being a code quality enforcer. But let's circle back to that perception gap from the metric study because I think this is crucial. Developers, who you'd think would be pretty good at measuring their own productivity, were off by 40 percentage points. They felt faster, even though they were demonstrably slower. And this isn't just about ego or wishful thinking. There's something about using these tools that creates this illusion of productivity. Maybe it's because the code appears so quickly on screen or because you feel like you're delegating work, but whatever it is, we're collectively fooling ourselves. The author actually describes his own journey from evangelist to skeptic, and it's kind of humbling. He was out there promoting these tools, convinced they were making him more productive, until he actually measured it. And that takes guts to admit publicly, especially in our industry where being on the cutting edge of technology is so valued. So where does this leave us? Well, if you're a developer, maybe it's time to actually measure whether these tools are helping or hurting. Don't just go by feel. If you're a manager, please don't slash your timelines based on vendor promises. And if you're someone waiting for that explosion of AI-generated software, well, you might be waiting a while longer. The thing is, this isn't really about being anti-AI. It's about being honest about what these tools can and can't do right now. And based on the evidence, or really, the lack of evidence in the form of missing shovelware, the revolutionary productivity gains just aren't there yet. Speaking of AI and productivity, this perception gap between how helpful we think AI is versus how helpful it actually is leads us to our next story, which takes this question even further. What if using AI isn't just failing to make us more productive, but is actually changing how our brains work? All right, now we're diving into something that's got the hacker news community absolutely fired up. MIT study finds AI use reprograms the brain, leading to cognitive decline. This one pulled in over 500 points and more than 500 comments. And honestly, the debate is way more interesting than the headline suggests. So here's what happened. Researchers at MIT ran this study where they took 54 students and split them into 3 groups. One group wrote essays using just their brains, another could use search engines, and the third group got to use ChatGPT. And while they were writing, the researchers hooked them up to EEG machines to monitor their brain activity. What they found was, well, depending on who you ask, either terrifying or completely overblown. The study showed that students using ChatGPT had noticeably different brain patterns. Their neural connectivity was weaker across multiple brainwave bands, alpha, beta, delta, theta, the whole alphabet soup. The researchers described it as the brain essentially going into a kind of passive mode. But here's where it gets really wild. When they tested these students afterward, 83% of the ChatGPT users couldn't quote a single sentence from the essays they literally just written. Not one sentence. Meanwhile, almost 90% of the students who use search engines or just their brains could accurately recall what they'd written. Now, before we all panic and throw our AI assistants out the window, let's talk about what the hacker news community had to say, because they absolutely tore this study apart. And I mean, they went forensic on it.
First off, the sample size. 18 people per group. That's it. We're talking about drawing conclusions about reprogramming the human brain from studying fewer people than you'd find in a typical coffee shop line. Multiple commenters pointed out that with samples this small, you could probably find statistical significance in anything if you looked hard enough. But the real kicker, the study authors themselves, and this is crucial, explicitly warned against using terms like cognitive decline or brain damage. They actually said, don't use these words. And yet here's the article throwing around cognitive decline like it's going out of style. One commenter dug into the actual paper and found that the researchers were much more measured in their language, talking about cognitive adaptation rather than decline. What's fascinating to me is how this touches on something we're all kind of worried about, right? Like, are we getting dumber because of technology? It's the same anxiety we had about calculators, about GPS, about autocorrect. One commenter made this brilliant point. They said their grandmother probably thought they were experiencing cognitive decline because they couldn't navigate by the stars or preserve food without a refrigerator. There's this whole camp of people in the comments saying,
Actually, AI has made me smarter. They're using ChatGPT to learn electronics, to understand complex coding concepts, to explore topics they'd never have the confidence to tackle on their own. One person described it as having a patient tutor who never gets frustrated when you ask the same question for the fifth time. But, and there's always a but, there's something unsettling about that 83% number. The fact that these students couldn't remember what they had written just minutes ago. Even if we dismiss the sensationalized language about brain damage, that's still telling us something important about engagement and ownership, isn't it? The study called it cognitive adaptation toward passivity, which is a much more nuanced way of saying your brain learns to coast when it knows AI will do the heavy lifting. It's like, remember when you first got GPS and stopped paying attention to street names? Your brain just offloaded that task. The question is whether that's actually bad or just different. One of the more thoughtful comments pointed out that we might be optimizing for the wrong things entirely. These AI-generated essays scored well. The output was good. But if the students aren't actually learning or engaging with the material, what are we really accomplishing? It's like getting an A on a test you won't remember taking.
The community also raised some killer methodological questions. Like, were the students in the ChatGPT group just bored? If you're basically copy-pasting from an AI, of course your brain's going to check out. That's not necessarily rewiring, that's just being bored. And the EEG patterns might just be showing the difference between active creation and passive consumption, which we already knew were different cognitive states. What really strikes me about this whole discussion is how it reveals our deep ambivalence about AI tools. We want the productivity boost, we love the assistance, but we're terrified of losing something essential about how we think and learn. And maybe that fear is worth examining, even if this particular study isn't the smoking gun some people want it to be. The truth is, probably somewhere in the messy middle, like it usually is. AI tools are changing how we work and think. That much is obvious. Whether that change constitutes decline or just adaptation might depend entirely on what we value and what we're trying to achieve. But one thing's for sure, we need way better research than 54 college students hooked up to EEG machines to figure it out. Now, while we're all debating whether AI is making us smarter or dumber, developers are still clamoring for better AI integration in their tools. Which brings us to our next story about what happens when the demand for AI features is so intense that maybe, just maybe, a product gets rushed to market before it's really ready. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the developer community absolutely buzzing. Claude Code now in beta in Zed. And folks, the way this announcement was written is honestly kind of brilliant. Instead of a traditional press release, they literally just posted screenshot after screenshot of developers begging for this feature. It's like you wanted it, you got it. So here's what's happening. Zed, which is this relatively new code editor that's been gaining traction as a faster, more modern alternative to VS Code, has finally integrated Claude Code into their assistant panel. And the demand for this, wow. The article is basically just a wall of tweets and posts from developers saying things like, I'll switch to Zed the second you add Claude Code, and this is the only thing keeping me from using Zed full time.
But here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit messy. The Hacker News discussion with 338 comments reveals that while everyone's excited about the potential here, the actual implementation is, let's call it rushed. Users are reporting that critical features are just straight up missing. No slash commands, no ability to switch between Claude models, no plan mode, which if you've used Claude Code before, you know that's huge. One user described it as they literally just took the API and slapped it into the editor. What's fascinating to me is this tension that's emerging in the discussion. On one hand, you've got developers who are frustrated because they can't do basic things, like use the /compact command to manage their context window. They're running into token limits and can't even see how much context they're using. That's pretty fundamental stuff. But then there's this other camp, led by a user named JRYO,
who's making this really compelling argument that maybe we're thinking about this all wrong. They're saying, look, instead of every editor building their own bespoke AI integration, we should be pushing for standardization. They mention protocols like MCP and ACP, Model Context Protocol, and Agentic Computer Protocol, that could make AI assistants work across any editor, just like how Language Server Protocol made language support universal. And you know what? They might be onto something. One user, OSDAB, made this point that really stuck with me. They said we need some common protocol for agents so that switching editors doesn't mean losing your entire AI workflow. Because right now, if you're deep into Cursor's AI features or GitHub Copilot and VS Code, switching editors means basically starting from scratch with how you interact with AI. The implementation issues are real, though. Multiple users are reporting that they're just running Claude code in the terminal inside Zed instead of using the actual integration, because it's more functional that way. That's not great for a feature that was supposedly the most requested thing for this editor. But here's what I think is the bigger story. This whole situation shows just how critical AI assistants have become to modern development. The fact that developers are literally choosing their editors based on AI integration rather than, actual editing features, that's a massive shift. We've gone from, does this editor have good syntax highlighting, to, can I use Claude code in this?
And the editor switching friction that's coming up in the comments is super real. People are saying things like, I've got years of VS Code customization, profiles for different projects, extensions I rely on daily. And now they're being asked to throw all that away just to get better AI integration. It's creating this really interesting dynamic where editors need to be both highly customizable and support standardized AI protocols. The Zed team, to their credit, seems to be listening. But right now, if you're looking to switch to Zed specifically for Claude code, you might want to wait a bit. The consensus seems to be that it's a promising start, but needs significant work before it matches what you can do with Claude code in other environments, or even just in the terminal. Though I gotta say, the fact that 547 people upvoted this announcement despite all these issues shows just how hungry developers are for better AI integration options. All right, let's shift gears completely here. While some projects are struggling with rushed releases and disappearing maintainers, here's a story that shows what can happen when a community refuses to let great software die. All right, so our next story is about Magic Lantern making its comeback. And honestly, this is one of those feel-good open source stories that just makes you smile. For those who don't know, Magic Lantern is this incredible firmware add-on for Canon DSLRs that basically unlocks a treasure trove of features that Canon never gave you access to. We're talking about things like raw video recording, advanced bracketing, focus peaking, audio meters, basically turning your consumer DSLR into something approaching a professional cinema camera. Now, here's where it gets interesting and kind of heartbreaking. The project essentially died around 2020 when the original lead developer, who went by A1X, just vanished. And when I say vanished, I mean left behind what the new team describes as fragmentary documentation and a build system that literally nobody else could figure out. This is the classic bus factor problem in open source, right? When your entire project depends on one brilliant person who holds all the knowledge in their head, you're basically one life event away from total collapse. For 5 years, Magic Lantern was essentially dead in the water. Users were stuck with old builds, no updates, no bug fixes, nothing. And if you've ever relied on open source software for your creative work, you know how anxiety-inducing that can be. You're sitting there with your Canon 5D Mark III thinking, is this firmware going to work with the next memory card I buy? What if I upgrade my computer? But here's the beautiful part. A group of community members refused to let it die. 4 people stepped up. G3 Jego, Kitor, Names Are Hard, and Walter Schultz. And they didn't just patch things up, they rebuilt the entire thing from scratch. New website, new repository, migrated everything to Git, modernized the build system so it actually compiles without warnings, which, if you've ever worked with legacy code, you know is basically a miracle. The new lead developer, Names Are Hard, and yes, that's their actual handle, which I love, is being refreshingly honest about the situation. They're saying, look, I'm sometimes the only active developer here, which you gotta wonder if they're setting themselves up to repeat history, right? But at least they're being transparent about it and actively calling for contributors. What really struck me reading through the Hacker News comments is how emotional people are getting about this. You've got photographers talking about how Magic Lantern kept their 10-year-old cameras relevant, how it let them shoot professional work on consumer gear. One commenter made this great point about how the photography industry is weirdly closed compared to, say, music production. In music, you've got open formats, plugin standards, interoperability everywhere. But cameras? Good luck getting any manufacturer to play nice with others. There's also this fascinating technical discussion happening about the actual resurrection process. Apparently, the old codebase was such a mess that they basically had to reverse engineer their own project. The original developer had created this Byzantine build system that was so complex, the new team just threw it out and started over. And honestly, good for them. Sometimes the best way to save a project is to admit that the old way wasn't working. Now, there is some healthy skepticism in the comments. One user pointed out that they're still using a personal GitHub account instead of an organization, which means if Names Are Hard disappears tomorrow, we could be right back where we started. Another person hilariously called out the "you just need to know C" claim for contributing, comparing it to saying, "you just need to know how to play violin to join an orchestra." Fair point. Embedded firmware development isn't exactly beginner-friendly.
But you know what? The fact that this project is back at all is kind of amazing. In an era where cameras are increasingly locked down, where manufacturers are pushing cloud services and subscriptions, having an open source option that lets you truly own and control your hardware, that matters. It's not just about the features, though raw video on a camera that doesn't officially support it is pretty sweet. It's about the principle that if you buy something, you should be able to modify it, improve it, make it work the way you want. The team is promising regular releases for all supported cameras going forward, and they're actively working on expanding support. Whether they can maintain momentum this time around, we'll see. But for now, Magic Lantern is back. And that's a win for anyone who believes in open source, right to repair, and actually owning the devices you paid for. Now, from the resurrection of open source projects to something completely different, let's talk about a quirky cultural phenomenon that's got people scratching their heads about Japanese television. Story 4. The staff ate it later. All right, so here's something completely different. Our next story is the staff ate it later. And before you wonder what on earth that means, this is actually a fascinating glimpse into Japanese TV culture that's gotten 445 points and sparked quite the discussion on Hacker News. So picture this, you're watching a Japanese variety show and they're showcasing this gorgeous spread of food from a local restaurant. And then at the bottom of the screen, you see this little caption that translates to, "The staff ate it later." It's everywhere on Japanese TV, and it turns out there's this whole story behind why it exists. Apparently, this all started because viewers were getting genuinely upset about food waste. There was this incident with a show called Downtown Nogaki no Tsukai Rahenda, try saying that 3 times fast, where they featured these small watermelons and viewers just flooded them with complaints about wasting food. The producer's response? Start putting up these disclaimers to reassure everyone that no, we're not just throwing this stuff away. Now, what's really interesting here is the debate about whether this is even true. Like, are the staff actually eating all this food? According to the Wikipedia article and the Hacker News discussion, multiple industry insiders say yes, absolutely. There's this food comic artist Raswell Hosoki and TV personality Eriko Miyazaki who both confirm it happens. One crew member even said they eat it out of consideration and a feeling of obligation towards the restaurant, which that's such a specifically Japanese way to put it, right?
The Hacker News crowd had some fascinating takes on this. You've got people who've actually worked in TV and film production chiming in with their experiences. One user talked about working on a kids' show where they'd make these elaborate fake meals out of real food. And yeah, the crew would absolutely demolish everything afterwards. Another person mentioned working on commercials where they'd have like 20 identical pizzas for different takes, and the crew would take them home in boxes. But here's where it gets really interesting culturally. This whole thing ties into the Japanese concept of multanai, this deep cultural aversion to waste that's just baked into the society. One commenter who lived in Japan pointed out that even tiny things like not finishing your rice at a restaurant can be seen as disrespectful. It's not just about the waste itself, it's about respect for the farmers, the chef, everyone in that chain. There's this contrarian view, though, that I found pretty compelling. A user named UnsignedInt argued that these disclaimers are actually part of a bigger problem with Japanese TV, this tendency to over-explain everything and treat viewers like children. They're saying it's contributing to the dumbing down of television, pandering to a tiny minority of complainers rather than just letting things be. And then someone else pointed out this delicious bit of irony. They said Westerners who complain about food waste often overconsume calories themselves, essentially wasting food internally. Which, okay, that's a spicy take, but it does make you think about how we conceptualize waste differently across cultures. What really strikes me about this whole thing is how it shows the power of audience feedback in shaping media, but in such a specific, culturally bound way. Can you imagine American TV shows putting up disclaimers about what happened to the food? Like, don't worry, Gordon Ramsay's production crew ate all those beef Wellingtons. It would never happen. We have no animals were harmed for films, but food, that's just not on our cultural radar the same way. The discussion also revealed some practical realities about food on sets. Apparently, in the US at least, there are strict union and insurance rules about food safety. If food's been sitting under hot lights for hours, it often has to be thrown out regardless. One person mentioned that on Iron Chef America, most of the food couldn't be eaten because of how long it had been out.
You know what this really reminds me of? It's like those pharmaceutical ads in the US, where half the runtime is disclaimers about side effects. Every country has its own weird media court that seems totally normal internally, but bizarre to outsiders. For Japan, it's reassuring viewers about food waste. For us, it's, well, telling people that their allergy medicine might cause gambling addiction. The whole thing is this perfect little window into how different societies handle the same basic tensions between entertainment and ethics, between practical production needs and cultural values. And honestly, I kind of love that Japanese TV takes this seriously enough to address it, even if some people think it's excessive. It shows a level of consideration that's refreshing in a way. And that wraps up today's deep dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. What a ride, right? We started with developers questioning whether AI is actually making us more productive, or if we're all just victims of a collective delusion. We saw MIT researchers claiming our brains are being rewired by ChatGPT, though maybe not in the apocalyptic way the headlines suggest. We watched the community wrestle with rushed AI integrations that promise the world, but deliver, well, less than that. We celebrated the resurrection of Magic Lantern after 5 years in the wilderness, and we ended with a delightfully weird cultural quirk about Japanese TV and food waste. If there's a theme running through all of these stories, it's about the gap between promise and reality, between what we hope technology will do and what it actually does. Whether it's AI coding assistants that might be slowing us down, studies that might be overblown, or open source projects that need communities to save them, we're all trying to figure out how to navigate this increasingly complex tech landscape. These were the top 5 stories out of 29 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, chosen because they sparked the most passionate discussions, the most upvotes, and, frankly, the most interesting debates. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another set of stories that get the tech community talking. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe actually measure whether that AI tool is really making you faster before you tell your manager it is. This has been Hacker News Daily. I'm your host, and we'll see you tomorrow.